As the Jets try to go from 3-3 to their first playoff appearance since 2010, we're going to talk about their biggest advantages today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Tuesday, October 24th, 2023, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. If you enjoy the show and are watching on YouTube, give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help us out, help other Jets fans find the show. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Last-minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Well, the Jets are 3-3 heading into Week 8. They have just completed their bye week, and it's a good 3-3. And today we're going to talk about the biggest advantages the Jets have as they try to go from 500 through the first 6 games to their first playoff berth since 2010, which of course is the longest playoff drought in the NFL. It's the longest playoff drought in the NFL by 5 years. Every other team has at least made the playoffs once since the year 2015. So we've got some work to do. But as I mentioned, this is a good 3-3. Sometimes you get out of the gate and you have big expectations and you're 500 through the first 6 weeks, and it's a sign, maybe things aren't going so well. For the Jets, that's completely different. And we know that they lost their quarterback, Aaron Rodgers, 4 plays into the season. We know they've had some other key injuries along the way, like Elijah Vera Tucker, even Dwayne Brown to a lesser extent, and they've weathered the storm. But even if everybody was healthy, this was a schedule that always seemed front-loaded. It seemed like the Jets had their toughest games at the very beginning, and even with Aaron Rodgers in there, we always said that if they got through the first 6, 3-3, they'd be in really good shape going forward. And I think it goes double with Zach Wilson at quarterback, because I think anybody would have signed up for 3-3 through the first 6 if you knew Zach Wilson was going to be the quarterback. You would have signed up for that in a second. Now, moving to the final 2/3 of the season, really, not the second half, because the bye did not come at the halfway point this year. I think there are some advantages the Jets have, especially the way the roster is constructed at the moment, that could really help them. And the first one to me, and I think this was kind of on display in the last game the Jets played, which was the upset win over the Philadelphia Eagles. On the defensive side of the ball, I feel like there's good balance. So what do I mean by that? It's not so much that the pass defense is as good as the run defense are equally good. I think the pass defense is probably, at the end of the day, going to be better than the run defense. But it's that the pass defense is more important. In the NFL, there's a much bigger correlation to winning in the passing game than there is the run game. And that's true on both sides of the ball. Teams that throw the ball effectively tend to win games. Teams that run the ball effectively, you don't really know. The same is true on the other side. Teams that shut down the pass, they tend to win games. Teams that shut down the run, it depends. And a good example of that, through this long stretch where the Jets have struggled to make the playoffs, where the Jets have struggled to win, going back to 2010, more often than not, the Jets have had an excellent run defense, even in all these losing seasons. But it shows you that the passing game is more correlated with wins and losses. And I think when it comes to shutting down the pass, that's where the Jets have some decent balance, because there are really 2 components of shutting down an opposing team's passing attack. One is getting pressure to the quarterback, because, as you know, pressure tends to make quarterbacks less effective. They have to throw quicker than they want to. It messes up the timing on routes. And, in the modern NFL, routes are based on timing. If you ever watch the film, one of the things you'll notice is that the first receiver usually makes his break right as the quarterback's back foot is hitting the top of his drop. And the second read tends to break like maybe an instant later. That's when the quarterback will be looking at him. So if you get to the quarterback and force him to throw early, you really mess the play up. So there's that component of it. There's also the component that quarterbacks don't like getting hit. You hit a quarterback enough, you get enough pressure. Even if he hears footsteps, even if you don't necessarily hit him, you're going to start impacting him. And there's the obviously concrete point to this, which is if you sack a quarterback, he's not going to complete a pass. 100% of the time, a sack results in a gain of 0 or less. More often, it results in a loss. Occasionally, there's a sack that gives you 0 yards, but most of the time a sack creates a negative play. So there's a lot that goes into it. Pass rush is obviously an important component of shutting down the pass. Obviously, so is coverage. I mean, these are the guys who are defending the receivers who go out into patterns. So obviously, it's clear that they have a big impact in shutting and helping the defense to slow down the other team's passing attack. Now, there's always the debate, which would you rather have? Would you rather have a great pass rush, or would you rather have great cover guys? And really, there's only one answer. The answer is you'd rather have both. I mean, you want to be as good as possible across the board. And I think that's true in general in the NFL, but it's especially true shutting down the other team's passing attack. You want to be able to do a little bit of everything. And there are lots of different reasons for that. I mean, the two units kind of help each other out. Again, if a quarterback's getting on the receiving end of pressure, it's easier for the corners to cover. It's easier for the guys in coverage to make plays because they don't have to cover for as long. It's easier to cover for 2 seconds than it is for 5 seconds. But on the reverse side, if you lock down other receivers, it gives the pass rushers more time to get to the quarterback. If you have a corner who's capable of shutting down a receiver for 4 or 5 seconds, that's 4 or 5 seconds for your defensive lineman to sack the quarterback. If the quarterback's able to get it quickly, if somebody's able to get quick separation, the defensive line doesn't have as much time. And I think you could say fairly that the Jets pretty good in both spots. I think the defensive line's not been quite as good as we were hoping for. There are some guys who are underperforming, like Carl Lawson. I don't think the first-round pick, Will McDonald's, giving you exactly what you wanted from him. But the Jets have a good defensive line. There's lots of talent there. And even though the sacks haven't been there yet, the pressures have been coming at a pretty high rate. And on the back end of the defense, you have some really good corners. Sauce Gardner, who, even if he's not having quite the year he had a year ago, still a very good corner. I think any disappointment with Sauce Gardner's season is just a commentary on how high he set the bar last year. Sauce is having an excellent season. DJ Reed's a really good corner. And really, I think the unheralded guy, maybe on this entire team, maybe the most underrated player on this team, Michael Carter II. I mean, I think he's an elite slot corner right now. And he had a few issues against the Eagles when they played him outside, but I think Michael Carter II is, up there with the top slot corners in football. I think he's been that good. It started last year, but this year he's been excellent in my view in the slot. So Jets have good talent in both spots. Bryce Huff, Quinnen Williams, John Franklin Myers on the defensive line, and then the guys I mentioned at corner. And the reason that this is important, the game against the Eagles is actually a good example of this, that when you are lacking one of the two, the other can pick up the slack. The Jets were missing Sauce and they were missing DJ Reed in that game against Philadelphia. Well, again, if you have a good defensive line, your corners don't need to be as good. That you have guys who don't need to cover for as long. And the reverse will also be true going forward. And this is like, it's, I guess, like, I don't know if poker is the right analogy, but you have multiple ways to win. Different hands can win you the game. So if your corners aren't there for 1 week, the defensive line can go out and win you the game. And if the Jets suffer a few injuries on the defensive line, well, then they can lean them more on the corners. Now, in the ideal world, you got both because these things feed on each other. Great pass rushers make great corners better. Great corners make great pass rushers better. So in an ideal world, you want both. But even if you have to go without one, it means that you're not doomed. I mean, most teams would really struggle without their two starting corners in the lineup, without their top two corners in the lineup, as the Jets had against Philadelphia. The Jets were able to hold the Eagles to 14 points, and part of that was that they were able to lean on their defensive line a little bit more. So it just makes your team more resistant to stress when you have guys who can play well in multiple spots, which is a good segue to move on to what we're going to talk about in the offense moving ahead here on this episode of Locked On Jets. Because on the offense, I think the Jets, a team that for a long time had no go-to guys, they have two go-to guys on offense, and it kind of helps them in the same way as the strong pass rush and the strong corner play does on defense. And we'll talk about that more ahead on this Tuesday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by LinkedIn. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business, and you want to be 100% certain that you have access to the best qualified candidates available. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people for your team faster and for free. It's easy to create a free job post on LinkedIn. Then you add your job and the purple hashtag hiring frame to your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you're hiring. Simple tools like screening questions make it easy to focus on candidates with just the right skills and experience, so you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and hire. We're about to talk about Breece Hall and Garrett Wilson, two great players for the Jets. Fortunately, the Jets have a scouting department, so that they don't need to use LinkedIn Jobs. your business probably doesn't have a scouting department. LinkedIn Jobs could be that scouting department for your small business. And this is why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by PrizePicks. PrizePicks is the largest independently owned daily fantasy sports platform in North America. They're the easiest and most exciting way to play DFS. It's just you against the numbers. Instead of battling thousands of other players, including pros and sharks, you pick more or less than 2 to 6 player stat projections and watch the winnings roll in. PrizePicks offers weekly promotions that lead to big payouts like Taco Tuesday. It's Tuesday. Each Tuesday, PrizePicks discounts select player projections up to 25% to provide even more value. So head on over to PrizePicks today for Taco Tuesday. And PrizePicks now offers Apple Pay for quick and easy deposits into your account this football season. With the PrizePicks reboot policy, your entries stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. For NFL games and college football top 25 matchups, if you have a player who exits the game in the first half and does not return for the second half, that player is rebooted. PrizePicks is the only daily fantasy platform with this sort of injury insurance. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match of up to $100. Again, prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL, code LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match of up to $100 using PrizePicks. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. And a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday, and then bonus episodes as needed after games when big news breaks. Really great chatting with you each day about the New York Jets. Today we're talking about advantages the Jets have in terms of the way the team is built. Heading into the final 11 games of the season, Jets are trying to break this long playoff drought. We've talked about how the Jets had some balance on the defensive side of the ball. I don't think they necessarily have the same degree of balance on offense. In fact, I think their offense is heavily skewed to 2 guys, Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall. I don't think this is necessarily a complete offense. I think the offensive line has issues. Even if everybody's healthy, the offensive line has issues. And at the skill groups, there's a pretty steep drop-off after you get past Garrett and Breece. But the advantage the Jets have is that they don't just have one go-to guy on this unit. They have 2. And I've watched a lot of bad Jets teams through the years where you've had to talk yourselves into guys like Quincy Enunwa or Robbie Anderson or Chris Herndon as a potential go-to guy. And it's not been fun to do that because you've had to look at a guy these guys were decent NFL players for stretches, but they were certainly not the types of players you'd want to build an offense through. And finally, the Jets have 2 guys they can lean on. And that can make a big difference. And you've seen this, in the first 6 weeks where the Jets have gotten 3 wins. It hasn't always been pretty for the offense, but they've been able to just grind out enough. And a lot of that goes to these 2 guys just making enough plays. Especially when you're talking about a quarterback in Zach Wilson who has some flaws, who's still trying to really figure this thing out. He's better than he was last year, but I don't know if we're really at a point where it's an ideal situation that Zach Wilson's starting games for your football team. But one of the things that makes life easier for him is when you have not just one guy you can lean on, 2. I mean, Garrett Wilson's target share for the Jets is very high right now. He's getting a lot of targets. If you look at the volume he's getting, it's as high as almost any receiver in the NFL at the moment. That's why it's because Zach Wilson's looking to him. And when you have a young quarterback who sometimes struggles getting through his reads, a number 1 receiver, you always hear the tight end being the safety blanket, but really the number 1 receiver is the safety blanket for the young quarterback, because what he can do is he knows that, if I don't really understand what the coverage is, I'm just going to throw it to my guy. I trust my guy's going to be able to make a play. And I think that's the type of thing that can make such a difference for a developing young quarterback, because if he gets confused, he knows there's at least somebody who can trust. He knows there's at least somebody he can go to, and the odds are pretty good that the play is going to be made. And Breece Hall makes it even easier because all Zach has to do to get Breece Hall the football is just turn around and hand it to him. And these guys, the fact that there's 1 receiver and 1 running back is also beneficial, because I think it's the type of thing that will help simplify the game for Zach. Because most plays are, most of the time was when you make a read, it's based on the safeties. The first thing you look to as a quarterback are the safeties. That tends to be true pre-snap. It also tends to be true post-snap. So if you ever watch the film, you'll see sometimes usually there's either 1 safety deep or 2 safeties deep. And normally what you'll see, or in many cases, what you'll see on the film is a team will have 1 safety deep And then they'll have the second safety kind of like in this ambiguous area where he could go closer to the line at the snap, or he could drop back after the snap. And the reason they do that is this, again, the safeties are the first people the quarterback look to, because if the second safety drops back, that the offense is going to have a numbers advantage in the run game. They'll essentially have one blocker for every defender. So it tends to be easier to run the football against two safety looks. Whereas if there's a one safety look, if there's only one safety deep, that tends to mean that your receivers on the outside have one-on-one matchups. So you want to throw the ball. You may have heard, as there's been talk, if you've seen Jets games this year, about how the Jets tend to call two plays in the huddle, and then Zach Wilson gets to the line and decides which one they run. It's not always like this, but in many cases, what happens is there's one play called that's a pass play and one play called that's a run play. And generally speaking, the quarterback kind of has to figure out what the safety is doing. If the second safety is dropping deep, then they'll have an advantage in the run game and you hand the ball off. And if not, if the second safety drops, then essentially you look to the outside. You'll have those one-on-one matchups and you'll be able to throw the ball there. And you see this a couple times. I mean, it's definitely true on the film that there are moments where Zach Wilson just decides pre-snap he likes his matchup with Garrett Wilson, and that's where I'm going with the ball. Sometimes what happens is, the progression will be to the right side of the field. The three guys the quarterbacks are viewing as his primary targets are the right side of the field. But sometimes what happens is the quarterback may say at pre-snap, you know what, I like my matchup I got on the left side of the field, so that's where I'm going to go. And you see that happen with Garrett Wilson. That's a positive thing for the Jets because it shows that there's trust between the two of them. It shows that there's chemistry between the two of them, especially after what happened last year where Garrett Wilson was clearly frustrated with Zach. It's a positive that Zach and Garrett, it seems like there's more trust between the two of them this year. But I think Breece Hall and Garrett Wilson, they're the types of guys who are going to make each other better. There are going to be some weeks where it's going to be a Garrett Wilson week, like the game against Philadelphia. There are games where Garrett's got drawn a tough matchup, but the opponent's not a very good run defense, like against Denver. I think the fact that you have two of these guys, it makes life easier. It's always better to have one go-to guy than zero go-to guys, but it's better to have two than one because you can only stop one thing. You can only really, I think it's true in football. It's true on offense. It's true on defense. You can take away one thing from the other team, but you can't really take away two things. At some point you can always double team a guy. You can't really double team two guys. And I guess it's a little bit different when you're talking about a receiver and a running back, because again, it really comes down to that second safety. If the second safety drops down to the line of scrimmage, then your receiver is going to have a very advantageous matchup. Whereas if he plays deep, Breece Hall is going against the light box. So it's a good thing for the Jets, an offense that really not built all that well. If we're going to be honest, the Jets defense is built well. I don't think the Jets offense is built that well, but the fact you have two go-to parts, that's a big deal. That's the type of thing that will help this team. And maybe it'll just help them scratch out enough offense to make the playoffs. But ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to turn our attention to the third phase of this team. It's my favorite unit. I don't know if it's my favorite unit, but it's the unit I always think gets a bit not enough attention. It's the special teams, and Jets special teams have been excellent this year. We're going to praise that unit as we continue this Tuesday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Gametime. You should not have to worry when you're buying tickets to the next big event. Gametime is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater events near you. And with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their best price guarantees, Gametime takes all the guesswork out of buying tickets. You can see the view from your seat before you buy, so you know exactly what to expect when you arrive using Gametime. And all-in prices show you your total up front, so you know you're getting a great deal without hidden fees. You can buy tickets in seconds with just 2 taps. Gametime has deals on tickets right up to the start of the event and even an hour after it starts. It's the place to find last-minute seats, and you can find exclusive flash deals and sponsored deals on tickets for football, basketball, baseball, concerts, comedy, theater, and more. And with zone deals, you pick the section and Gametime picks the seats, an average of 18% savings. And the Gametime guarantee means you'll always get the best price. If you find tickets in the same section and row for less, Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference. I've used the Gametime app myself. It's super easy to use. It's super convenient. Great for last-minute tickets. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last-minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Tuesday. We're talking about advantages the Jets have as they approach the final 11 games of the season after a really solid 3-3 start through the toughest part of their schedule. I've talked about the balance on defense. I've talked about the multiple go-to guys on offense. Let's talk special teams. A unit that really does not get the attention it deserves. Around 20% of plays in the NFL are on special teams, but we always view it as an afterthought. And we really should not view it as an afterthought because special teams impacts a lot. A return touchdown can change the entire game, as we saw week 1 with Xavier Gipson. Field position can make a big difference, especially a team with a really good defense or maybe not such a good offense, kind of like the New York Jets. But also, around half of NFL games come down to one score or less. So these little changes that the special teams brings to play, they can make all the difference in the world. And the Jets have had arguably the best group of special teamers in the NFL this season. In fact, if you follow the metric DVOA, which used to be on Football Outsiders, now on a different website, and it's essentially this very convoluted statistical formula, they rate the Jets number 1 in special teams in the entire NFL this season. It's not hard to see why. Greg Zuerlein's having an excellent season, 14 for 15 on field goal attempts. I know I'm beating a dead horse with this, but it's nice that Joe Douglas finally figured out you just sign a guy who's a decent kicker, a guy who has a good track record in the NFL, and they're not that expensive and they're not that hard to find. And after, it took Joe Douglas, 3 years of bringing in these guys who couldn't kick from college with big legs, who have zero experience. For whatever reason, it took him like close to 3 years to figure this out, that you just sign guys with a track record of success in the NFL, and there's always a guy available. And finally, the Jets have done it, and now suddenly their kicking situation is pretty good. Thomas Morstead, his return, he's been excellent so far this season. Jets ranking in the top 10 in net punting average. And, I think we put those stats on punters, but I think when we're talking about net punting average, and that's like the total amount, it's essentially the length of the punt minus returns that the other team has made. The credit also has to go to the coverage units. It shows that the punter and the coverage units are in sync, because you don't want your punter out kicking his coverage. Sometimes a punter will have a great a great average because he'll punt the ball really far, but he's out kicking his coverage. So the return guy has plenty of green daylight in front of him, as essentially has a chance to build up a head of steam by the time the coverage guys get there. You want a guy who's like in sync, a guy who hits the ball perfectly, and Thomas Morstead's doing that very well. And then, of course, you look at Xavier Gipson, who, I'll be honest with you, outside of the one return against Buffalo, I don't think has been that great, but he is in the top 10 in both punt return average and kick return average. And look, I guess you can't really say outside of that one return against Buffalo, because that won the Jets a game. If the Jets don't get that big return against the Bills, we don't know how that game turns out. The Jets, maybe the Jets lose, maybe it ends in a tie. Jets were able to bank a huge win that first week of the season. And I go back to what I said that night. That was the type of win that just, I think, changed everything. Maybe you'll disagree with this. Maybe you'll think I'm taking this too far, but I think you have to remember in the moment how devastating that loss of Aaron Rodgers was. And if the Jets had lost that game to Buffalo, I'm not sure they have the confidence going forward. And I understand they actually went on a 3-game losing streak after that night, but I don't know. I feel like that win may have built some confidence into this team, and Xavier Gipson played a huge role in that victory. So really, you got the Jets playing well almost all phases of special teams. I think the return's been more hit or miss, but the kicking game's doing good things for the Jets. And I think that's the type of thing. I think back to the Mike Westhoff days, those early Rex Ryan teams in 2009, 2010, whenever they won a big game, usually somebody on special teams was stepping up and making a big play at a pivotal moment. The Jets, in those key games, especially the playoff games, the Jets always won the special teams battles when they won games. And I don't think that was an accident. Again, when you talk about playing the best teams in the NFL, when you talk about trying to make the playoffs, a lot of these games come down to one score or less. And there's a lot of luck that comes into winning a one-score game, but there's also a lot of hidden things, a lot of things you don't think about. And performing well on special teams can be one of them. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help us out, help other Jets fans find the show. Have a great Tuesday, everybody. Tomorrow, we're having our weekly mailbag. Each Wednesday, we try and do a mailbag on this podcast, so please send in your questions.